The Johnson family was enjoying the perfect birthday celebration for their son, Ethan. Laughter echoed through the backyard, and colorful balloons swayed in the breeze. But as the party reached its peak, something unexpected happened, an unwelcome disruption that would change everything. What was supposed to be a joyful occasion quickly turned into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Stay tuned, because what happened next will leave you speechless. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow across the sprawling backyard of the Johnson family's home. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the sweet smell of cupcakes, their bright frosting sparkling in the daylight. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon, and Charlotte Johnson couldn't have asked for a better way to celebrate her son Ethan's 7th birthday. The backyard was alive with activity, every corner buzzing with the laughter of children, the chatter of family members, and the soft rustling of streamers fluttering in the gentle breeze. The vibrant colors of the decorations were a feast for the eyes. Balloons in shades of red, yellow, and blue hung from the trees and the fence, while a large banner that read, "Happy 7th Birthday, Ethan," fluttered in the wind, welcoming everyone to the celebration. The garden was transformed into a playground of joy, where the Johnsons' closest friends and family had gathered to share in the excitement of the day. Children ran past, their faces painted with bright flowers, animals, and superheroes, their laughter echoing through the air as they darted between the bouncy castle and the face-painting station set up by the corner of the yard. Ethan, wide-eyed with wonder, was at the center of it all, a whirlwind of energy in his new superhero costume. His laughter was infectious, ringing out every time he made a new balloon animal. The first was a dog. He had been so proud of it, but it was the sword-shaped balloon that caught Charlotte's attention. He rushed over to her, holding it high with a grin that could light up the entire world. "Look, Mom, it's a sword," Ethan said, his voice filled with pride. Charlotte knelt down, her heart swelling with love as she ran her fingers through his hair. "It's perfect, baby. You're the bravest knight I know." She kissed him on the forehead, and he dashed off to join his friends, the sword held high like a trophy of his own making. Charlotte stood up, her eyes following him for a moment, then turned to take in the sight of the celebration. Nathaniel, her husband, was standing near the grill, flipping burgers while chatting with some of the other parents. His presence was a calm force amid the swirl of excitement. He looked over and met her gaze, giving her a subtle, affectionate nod that made her smile. It had been a long week. Work had been stressful, and the house had been a flurry of last-minute preparations. But today, everything was exactly as they had envisioned. Their son, surrounded by his closest friends and family, was having the time of his life, and that was all that mattered. "Everything looks amazing, Nate," Charlotte said, her voice full of contentment as she moved to his side. Nathaniel, a tall man with broad shoulders and a warm smile, grinned at her. "We make a good team," he said, flipping another burger onto the grill. "I'm just glad Ethan's happy. Look at him go." Charlotte's eyes softened as she watched Ethan leading a group of kids on a scavenger hunt she had set up earlier. His energy was boundless, and she loved watching him interact with his friends. His little world of wonder was expanding with every passing year. They had worked so hard to make this day special for him, and seeing it all come to life felt like a small victory. The sound of music drifted through the air from the speakers placed on the patio, adding an upbeat rhythm to the festivities. A nearby table was laden with treats, cupcakes in every color imaginable, bowls of fresh fruit, cookies shaped like stars and animals, and a punch bowl filled with a bright tropical concoction. Guests were chatting in small groups, some gathered around the food, others lounging on comfortable chairs, enjoying the laid-back atmosphere. Charlotte's parents, Robert and Grace, were sitting by the edge of the yard, laughing as Grace helped one of the younger kids perfect a dance move they were learning for the birthday performance. The sound of a child's joyful squeal filled the air as they jumped into the bouncy castle once more. And Charlotte smiled as she noticed the joy on the faces of their guests. She could hear the voices of the adults, too, catching up with one another after what felt like an eternity of busy schedules and missed gatherings. It was a rare moment of peace and unity, everyone coming together to celebrate life's simple, beautiful moments. Ethan ran past her again, his laughter infectious as he ran to the birthday table to claim a cupcake with the biggest frosting swirl on top. Charlotte's heart warmed at the sight. This was exactly the kind of day they had wanted. It wasn't just about the decorations or the food. It wasn't even about the presents that had been carefully stacked on the side. It was about the people, their friends and family, coming together to surround Ethan with love and happiness on his special day. "Charlotte, this party is incredible," said Andrea, one of Charlotte's oldest friends, joining her with a smile. "You've outdone yourself." Charlotte laughed softly. "We've worked hard for this one, but it's worth it. Look at Ethan," she said, her eyes following him as he laughed with his friends. "He's having the time of his life." As the day wore on, the sun began to lower, casting a soft, golden light over everything. The energy of the party only seemed to rise, the children becoming more playful as the adults lingered in conversation, their voices mingling with the distant hum of the nearby highway. Charlotte felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the love of her family, the joy of her son, and the perfect harmony of the day. Ethan's laughter, his unrestrained happiness, echoed in her heart, reminding her of everything she had worked for, everything they had worked for. For now, there were no worries, no concerns, only the sound of joy, the feeling of togetherness, and the perfect moment of a birthday celebration that would live in their memories forever. Little did they know, this perfect day was about to take a turn none of them could have anticipated. But for now, the party continued, a beautiful, carefree celebration of life and family. From her living room window, Mrs. Carter watched the lively scene unfolding at the Johnsons' house with growing discomfort. The rhythmic sound of children's laughter drifted over the fence, mixing with the soft hum of the neighborhood. But instead of easing her nerves, it only seemed to heighten them. She was accustomed to the calm, predictable pace of suburban life, the quiet streets, the occasional dog walkers, the gentle sounds of nature that filled the air. The Johnsons' house, however, seemed like an anomaly in this otherwise tranquil setting. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed as she watched the steady flow of unfamiliar faces, the laughter of children echoing through the air, and the occasional burst of joy from the bouncy castle. There were too many people, too much noise, and something about it all made her uneasy. As she watched, her mind began to race. She had never been fond of surprises, especially not the kind that came in the form of large gatherings in her otherwise quiet neighborhood. She muttered under her breath, "Who are these people? What are they doing there?" Her brow furrowed as she tried to identify the faces of the guests, but the colorful blur of bodies made it difficult. There was something about the energy of the crowd that she couldn't shake, something that felt out of place. Her son, Richard, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a stoic expression, entered the room and glanced over at his mother, immediately sensing her discomfort. He had been accustomed to her peculiar habits, her tendency to worry about things that didn't concern her, but this time there was a certain tension in the air that he hadn't seen before. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, stepping closer to the window to see what had caught her attention. She didn't answer right away, her eyes fixed on the Johnsons' backyard. Her lips pressed together in a tight line, and her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Richard could see that she was deeply agitated, far more than usual. "It's just a birthday party, Mom," he said gently, trying to ease her mind. But she wasn't listening. No, Richard," she muttered, shaking her head. "There's something not right about all this. It's too much. I've never seen so many strangers at their house before. What are they doing? Why are they all gathered there like this?" Richard sighed, feeling a pang of frustration. His mother had always been overly cautious, and while he understood her concerns, this seemed excessive. It's a family party, for God's sake. Kids playing, adults chatting, the usual. You're making it into something more than it is. But Mrs. Carter wasn't convinced. She continued to stare at the gathering with a mixture of suspicion and unease. She had never liked the Johnsons much. Too many unknowns for her taste. The house was always too loud, too busy. She had watched them from a distance for years, always with a lingering discomfort, never able to shake the feeling that they didn't quite belong in the neighborhood. She didn't know why she felt that way. She just did. And now, seeing all these strangers, some of them dressed in clothes that didn't seem to fit in with the rest of the neighborhood, it unsettled her even more. They're... they're different, Mrs. Carter muttered, as if trying to convince herself. She was already imagining the worst: a chaotic crowd, unruly guests, a situation spiraling out of control. The idea that the gathering might simply be a celebration, happy, carefree, and innocent, didn't register in her mind. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to bring her back to reality. "It's just a party, Mom. You're overthinking it." But she wasn't listening. Her mind was already made up. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone on the table. "I don't trust this," she said, her voice tinged with panic. "I'm calling the police." Richard stared at her, incredulous. "Mom, are you serious? Over a birthday party?" But his protests fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Carter's fingers moved with surprising speed, dialing the number with a practiced hand. She didn't pause to explain herself or listen to her son's reasoning. She just knew something had to be done. Her instinct, her gut feeling, told her that this was more than just a birthday celebration. Her grip tightened on the phone as the dial tone rang, and her voice became more urgent with every second that passed. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice came through the line, cutting through the tension in the room. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath. "I live next door to the Johnsons on Maple Street," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "There's a large gathering at their house. Too many people, too much noise. I'm worried it's getting out of control. There are strangers there, and I don't know what's going on. You need to send someone to check it out. Now." The operator's voice remained steady, trying to calm her down. "Ma'am, is there a specific issue or emergency we should be aware of?" Mrs. Carter hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. There was no actual emergency. Nothing had happened yet. But her fear took over, and her thoughts became a jumble of worst-case scenarios. I'm not sure, but I think it's dangerous. I don't trust them. I think something's going to happen." The operator, sensing her distress but not yet convinced of any immediate danger, assured her that a patrol car would be sent out to assess the situation. As Mrs. Carter hung up the phone, she felt a momentary sense of relief, as if she had done something to regain control over the situation. Richard, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of disbelief and frustration, let out a long sigh. "You really think this is necessary, Mom?" But Mrs. Carter didn't respond. She turned back to the window, her eyes scanning the crowd once more. She was still on edge, still convinced that something wasn't right. In her mind, the birthday celebration wasn't just a simple gathering. It was the calm before the storm. Meanwhile, the party continued just a few houses down. Laughter echoed in the Johnsons' backyard, a world away from the growing tension inside Mrs. Carter's home. Little did anyone know, the storm was already brewing, though it wouldn't come in the form Mrs. Carter expected. The arrival of the police would soon change everything, and the perfect day of celebration would be shattered. But for now, the party went on, unaware of the watchful eye that had cast its shadow over them. The phone in Mrs. Carter's hand felt heavier with each passing second, as though it bore the weight of a decision she couldn't undo. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her resolve hardened as she prepared to make the call. She could hear the laughter of children and the hum of music from the Johnsons' backyard drifting faintly through the window. But the joy that filled the air only added to her growing unease. The sight of all those unfamiliar faces, the noise, the chaos, it all felt so out of place in this quiet, well-ordered neighborhood. She pressed the phone to her ear and dialed the local police station, her heart pounding in her chest. As the phone rang, she glanced out the window once more, her gaze fixed on the lively celebration that seemed to mock her concerns. When the operator finally answered, Mrs. Carter's voice was sharp and full of authority. "Hello, yes," she began, her words deliberate, laced with the tone of someone who knew they were in the right. "I need to report a disturbance at the Johnsons' residence on Maple Street. There's a large gathering going on, and it's causing a lot of noise. It doesn't look like the usual neighborhood party. There are a lot of unfamiliar faces, people I don't recognize." The operator's voice came through, calm and professional, asking for more details. Mrs. Carter could feel her pulse quicken, but she didn't hesitate. She knew this was serious. She had seen enough to know when something wasn't right, even if she couldn't put her finger on it. The thought that perhaps she was overreacting never crossed her mind. She could feel the unease in her gut, a sense of impending danger that only intensified as the seconds ticked by. "It's not just the noise," she continued, her voice growing more insistent. "There's something about the crowd, too many strangers, and some of them, they don't belong here. They're not from around here. It just doesn't feel right. It's not the kind of thing that happens in our neighborhood." The operator listened patiently, his voice steady but neutral, not giving away any hint of judgment. "I understand, ma'am. We'll send someone to check it out. Can you describe the scene more clearly? Is anyone behaving aggressively?" Mrs. Carter paused for a moment, as if trying to convince herself that what she was saying was justified. The truth was, she didn't know if anyone was behaving aggressively yet. No one had done anything overtly violent. But in her mind, that was beside the point. The very fact that so many unfamiliar faces had gathered in one place without any explanation was enough to trigger her suspicion. "I don't know," she muttered, her voice a mix of uncertainty and conviction. "But I'm telling you, it's not normal. People don't throw parties like this in a quiet neighborhood like ours. They're probably just looking for trouble. Who knows what's going on over there?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. The operator's calm response did little to ease the tension building in Mrs. Carter's chest. "We'll send a patrol car to investigate, ma'am," the operator said finally, his tone unflinching. "Please stay inside and do not approach the scene." Mrs. Carter's grip tightened on the phone. She nodded, as if the operator could see her, though she knew he couldn't. She wanted to hang up and tell herself she had done the right thing, but the nagging feeling of discomfort didn't go away. She glanced over at Richard, who was sitting across the room, arms crossed, watching her with an expression of disbelief. "You've done the right thing, Mom," Richard said quietly, though his words lacked conviction. He still couldn't understand why his mother was so sure something was wrong. But he said nothing more, not wanting to argue further. Mrs. Carter felt a brief moment of satisfaction, believing that by calling the police, she had taken action, had done something to protect her home, her neighborhood, her family. She had no idea how quickly that decision would spiral into something far more dangerous. As she hung up the phone, the satisfaction quickly began to sour, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. She had done what she thought was best. Now, all she had to do was wait and hope that the officers would take her concerns seriously. She turned away from the window and sank into a nearby chair, her mind still churning. Her eyes darted back toward the backyard, where the sounds of joy and laughter continued unabated. But that happiness, that carefree celebration, felt like an affront to everything she believed in. The Johnsons didn't belong in her world, not with their loud parties, their strangers, their seemingly endless gatherings. She had seen enough to know that their lives were chaotic, unpredictable, and that made her uncomfortable. In the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the thought that something was bound to go wrong. Something always did. The street was still quiet for the moment, the typical suburban calm settling back over everything. But for Mrs. Carter, there was no peace. She stared at the phone, as though waiting for some further instruction, as though the chaos of the world outside could somehow be controlled with the press of a button. What she didn't know was that the storm she feared was already in motion, and it wouldn't arrive in the way she expected. The birthday party, the celebration of a young boy's special day, was about to become the focal point of something far darker than she could have imagined. And her call to the police, meant to protect the peace, would soon ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. The birthday candles flickered brightly atop the cake, their flames casting a soft glow over Ethan's excited face. He stood poised, hands clasped together as he prepared to make a wish, surrounded by his friends, cousins, and family. Charlotte beamed at her son, her heart swelling with love as she encouraged him to blow out the candles. The chorus of voices around her rose in joyful unison, chanting, "Make a wish." But before Ethan could exhale, the sudden screech of tires sliced through the merriment, followed by the unmistakable sound of a police siren. Charlotte's smile faltered, her gaze instinctively shifting toward the street. She could see the flashing lights of a police car parked at the curb, its blue and red hues cutting through the otherwise peaceful suburban scene. A chill ran down her spine, but she quickly dismissed the unsettling feeling. Surely, it was a mistake. A misunderstanding. Nathaniel, who had been chatting with a few guests near the grill, noticed the shift in the atmosphere. He looked up and saw the officers approaching the yard, walking with a purposeful stride. Charlotte caught his eye, her face turning pale. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel frowned, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Before they could react, the officers, led by a tall man with a stern expression, reached the edge of the party. His badge gleamed under the sun as he surveyed the crowd with a sharp, calculating gaze. He looked out of place amidst the cheerful decorations and laughing children. "Excuse me," Officer Grant called, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We received complaints about a disturbance." A few of the partygoers paused, confused and wary. Some children giggled nervously, not understanding why their fun was being interrupted. Charlotte stepped forward, her calm demeanor at odds with the rising tension in her chest. "It's just a birthday celebration," she explained, her voice steady but edged with uncertainty. "We're just having a small get-together with close friends and family." Officer Grant's eyes narrowed as he scanned the crowd. His gaze moved over the faces, lingering on each one, as if trying to detect something out of place. "We've received reports of loud noise and an influx of unfamiliar people," he said, his tone firm. "This doesn't look like a typical neighborhood party." Charlotte's stomach dropped. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her, their curiosity now piqued. "I'm sorry if it's been too loud," she said, offering a polite but strained smile. "But it's just a family celebration. There's no need for any concern." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his focus, scanning the yard again. His eyes seemed to linger on certain faces, the ones that didn't fit the usual suburban mold. He was searching for something, anything that didn't belong. "Is everything all right here?" Officer Grant asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. His sharp gaze moved from Charlotte to Nathaniel, his presence now imposing in the midst of the once lively party. Nathaniel stepped forward, his posture stiffening as he instinctively placed himself between the officer and his family. "Yes, everything's fine," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, but with an edge that suggested he was growing irritated. "This is just a birthday party for our son. We haven't done anything wrong." Officer Grant's expression remained unreadable. He took a slow step toward the group, his gaze lingering on the decorations, the children running around, the smiles on the faces of the guests. But there was no warmth in his eyes, no understanding, just cold, professional scrutiny. "You're telling me this is all just a family celebration?" Officer Grant asked, his voice now carrying an underlying suspicion. Charlotte nodded, but she could feel the tension in her chest tightening, her throat suddenly dry. The air felt heavier, suffocating. "Yes, sir," she repeated, trying to maintain her composure. "Everyone here is a family member or a close friend." The officer continued to scan the crowd, his eyes briefly flicking over the group of adults, noticing their differing skin tones, the unfamiliar faces. A subtle shift in his demeanor told Charlotte everything she needed to know. He wasn't convinced. He wasn't looking for evidence of wrongdoing. He was waiting for it. He was waiting for something to confirm his unease. The guests exchanged wary glances, sensing the officer's growing suspicion. Some children stopped playing and started whispering, wondering why the adults were talking so seriously. Ethan, who had been so excited moments ago, now stood frozen next to his cake, his wide eyes darting between his parents and the officer. "Do you mind if we take a look around?" Officer Grant asked, his voice carrying the subtle weight of an unspoken demand. His eyes were locked on Charlotte's, waiting for her response. It wasn't a question, it was a command. Charlotte's stomach churned, but she nodded, though her mind raced with questions. What was happening? This was just a birthday party, nothing more. But the officer's presence felt increasingly intrusive, like the sudden shadow of something dark looming over the celebration. As Officer Grant stepped further into the yard, more police officers began to arrive, their vehicles lining the street and blocking the view of the once bustling festivities. The noise of the children's laughter faltered, replaced by uneasy whispers among the guests. Charlotte tried to remain calm, but her heart raced as she watched the officers move through the crowd, their eyes scanning each guest with the precision of a hunter. Nathaniel's muscles tensed, his protective instincts kicking in. He moved closer to Charlotte, his hand subtly resting on her arm. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "We're not doing anything wrong." But Charlotte didn't respond. She was too busy watching the officers, feeling the weight of their suspicion bearing down on her family. The birthday party, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a trap, a moment teetering on the edge of something far worse. As the officers continued to investigate, Charlotte and Nathaniel exchanged a look, one of confusion, frustration, and a growing sense of helplessness. How had it come to this? How had their innocent celebration turned into an interrogation? And as the officer at the front of the crowd called for backup, the realization began to settle in. Something was wrong. Very wrong. But what could they do? The bright colors of the balloons seemed to lose their vibrancy as the atmosphere thickened with unease. The laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by murmurs of confusion, glances exchanged between guests, and the low hum of voices shifting from light-hearted chatter to nervous whispers. Charlotte stood stiffly, her hand still resting on Ethan's shoulder as he clutched his balloon sword, his earlier excitement now replaced by confusion. His small face looked up at his mother, searching for answers, but she had none. Officer Grant had moved further into the crowd, his piercing eyes scanning everyone in sight. The officers had begun questioning the guests more aggressively, moving from group to group, treating everyone like potential suspects. A few teenagers who had been playing near the bouncy castle were now surrounded by two officers, their hands resting on their belts as they peppered the teens with questions. "How do you know the Johnsons?" one officer asked, his tone sharp. "What's your relationship to them?" The teenagers, visibly uncomfortable, glanced at one another, unsure of how to answer. "We're friends," one girl finally stammered, glancing nervously at her friends. "I've known Ethan since elementary school." The officer didn't seem satisfied. His eyes narrowed, his voice growing colder. "Friends?" he repeated, as though the word itself was foreign. "I'm going to need to see some ID." A chill passed through Charlotte. This wasn't just a simple visit. This wasn't just a polite check. It felt like they were being treated like criminals, as if every guest, every face in the crowd, was under suspicion. She watched Nathaniel, his jaw clenched, his muscles visibly tense as he moved closer to the group of teens, his voice calm but firm. "They're just kids," Nathaniel said, his voice rising slightly. "They're friends of our son. You don't need to harass them." Officer Grant's gaze snapped to Nathaniel, his eyes hardening. "We're just making sure everything checks out," he replied, his voice laced with an unspoken challenge. "If you have nothing to hide, then there's no problem, right?" Nathaniel's fists clenched at his sides, but he bit back the words that threatened to spill out. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, casting a glance at Charlotte, who was doing her best to maintain composure in front of their son. Ethan's eyes darted nervously from the officers to his parents, sensing the growing tension but unable to understand what was happening. "Mom?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "Why are the police here?" Charlotte crouched down to his level, forcing a reassuring smile, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "It's okay, baby. Everything's fine. The police are just making sure we're safe." She hoped her words would comfort him, but deep down, she knew he could sense the fear in her voice. The air felt thick with uncertainty as more officers arrived, their uniforms creating an imposing presence among the guests. As Charlotte tried to calm Ethan, her mother, Evelyn, approached from behind, her concerned eyes scanning the crowd of officers and guests alike. "Charlotte," she said, her voice laced with worry. "What's going on? Why are the police here?" Charlotte stood up and wiped her palms on her dress, trying to mask the anxiety clawing at her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was no explanation that could make sense of this situation. She tried to gather her thoughts, but the pressure of the moment made it impossible to think clearly. "They're just being thorough," Charlotte said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. She wasn't sure who she was trying to reassure more, her mother or herself. "I don't know why they're treating everyone like this." Evelyn frowned, her face tight with concern as she looked around at the officers. She had always been protective of Charlotte, always the voice of reason in times of trouble, but she could feel the unease growing. The smiles and laughter that had once filled the backyard were long gone, replaced by an unspoken sense of dread that hung over the party like a dark cloud. "Something's not right," Evelyn muttered, her eyes flicking to the officers as they continued their investigation, moving through the yard like shadows. Charlotte nodded, her eyes welling up with frustration. She had tried to make this birthday celebration special for Ethan, something joyful and carefree. But now it felt like the entire day had been hijacked by suspicion and hostility. She reached for Nathaniel's hand, their fingers intertwining for support, but the connection felt fragile in the face of the mounting tension. As the officers continued their questioning, more guests began to feel the weight of the situation. A few, already uncomfortable with the presence of the police, began to gather their things, exchanging quiet words and glances. Some guests were trying to make sense of the situation, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. But others were growing impatient, their voices rising as they began to question the officer's authority. "This is insane," one of the older relatives muttered, his voice harsh as he approached Nathaniel. "What's going on here? Why are they treating us like criminals?" Nathaniel looked at the group, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "I don't know," he said through gritted teeth, "but I'm about to find out." He took a step toward Officer Grant, his posture becoming more confrontational. "This is ridiculous. You've checked everyone. We've done nothing wrong. Why are you still here?" Officer Grant turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You'll have to excuse the thoroughness," he said coolly. "We just want to make sure everything checks out." But there was no apology in his tone, no recognition of the growing discomfort among the guests. It was as if the officers believed they were justified in this intrusion. Charlotte could feel her own patience wearing thin, the simmering frustration now bubbling to the surface. It wasn't just the officers she was angry at. It was the situation itself. Why was it that a simple family gathering had turned into this? What was it about their celebration that had drawn this kind of attention? As the questions continued and the officers circled the yard like hawks, Charlotte glanced around, her heart heavy. The joy that had once filled this space now seemed a distant memory, swallowed by the weight of suspicion and judgment. Ethan, who had once been so full of excitement, now clung to her side, his wide eyes filled with worry. The party had been transformed from a celebration of life and love to something darker, something more dangerous. And Charlotte couldn't help but feel the sting of injustice settle in her chest. They hadn't done anything wrong, but somehow it felt like they were being punished all the same. The uneasy murmurs of the guests swirled around the yard, like a storm gathering strength. Every second felt longer than the last as Charlotte stood at the edge of the chaos, holding Ethan close, trying to shield him from the growing tension. Nathaniel, however, was no longer standing idly by. His frustration had built to a boiling point, and he was determined to put an end to the farce. When Officer Grant moved toward Nathaniel's cousin, Marcus, the atmosphere took a sharp turn. Marcus, a tall and broad-shouldered man with a deep voice, had been chatting with some relatives near the food table. He turned to face the officer, his brow furrowed with confusion. "Identification," Officer Grant demanded, his voice blunt and unyielding, like an order from someone with complete authority. Marcus hesitated, his hands visibly shaking as he reached into his pocket. Charlotte's chest tightened as she watched. "Marcus, don't do this," she called out, stepping forward, her voice breaking through the hushed whispers of the crowd. "We're not criminals. We're just having a birthday party." Her words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. She couldn't comprehend how it had escalated to this, how a peaceful family gathering had been hijacked by such hostility. It was supposed to be a celebration. They were supposed to be making memories with their son, not dealing with interrogations in front of their closest friends and family. Marcus reluctantly handed over his driver's license to Officer Grant, who inspected it with a sense of disdain. Charlotte's frustration flared, her voice now stronger, tinged with anger. "What is this really about? Why are you treating us like criminals at our own house? We've done nothing wrong." Officer Grant didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the ID in his hand, as though he were searching for something, anything, to justify his intrusion. But when he finally spoke, it was not to offer an explanation or apologize for his actions. Instead, he turned toward Nathaniel, his tone dripping with condescension. "If you want this to go smoothly," Officer Grant warned, his eyes narrowing, "I suggest you stop interfering." His words were sharp, like a slap to the face. "It's best for everyone if you cooperate." Nathaniel's face turned red with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. He stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of years of frustration. "Cooperate? You've been here long enough. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Why are you treating our guests like this?" Officer Grant's cold gaze flickered for a moment, but he didn't back down. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be," he growled. "We're just doing our job." Charlotte watched helplessly as her husband and the officer exchanged words. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about the noise complaint or the unfamiliar guests. It was something deeper, something more personal. There was an unspoken tension in the air, one that seemed to grow thicker with each word exchanged. The officers had arrived with a purpose, and now it seemed like they weren't going to leave until they had made a point. But what point? Charlotte couldn't understand. Her mind raced. Was it because they were black? Was it because their joy had been too much for someone to tolerate? She could feel the anger welling up inside her, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not with Ethan watching, not with her family standing around them. The last thing she wanted was for their son to see this ugly side of the world, to see how quickly peace could shatter. Then, just as Officer Grant turned his back to speak to his colleagues, a commotion erupted from the side of the yard. One of the officers had grabbed a young man by the arm, another guest, this one a college student named Chris, who had been talking to a few friends near the fence. Chris's eyes widened in shock and confusion. "What are you doing?" Chris shouted, struggling to free himself from the officer's grip. "What did I do?" The sudden outburst sent a ripple of panic through the crowd. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat as the officers turned to face Chris. The tension in the air shifted, becoming even more charged as the guests stepped back, unsure of how to respond. Chris's voice broke the silence, his words filled with the panic that was slowly creeping into the party. "I didn't do anything. What do you want from me?" His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, instinctively trying to give the officer his ID. But the officer wasn't interested in a simple ID check. His grip tightened on Chris's arm, and his face twisted with irritation. Nathaniel saw what was happening before anyone else did. His protective instinct flared. He lunged forward, his voice rising. "Get your hands off him!" Before anyone could react, Nathaniel reached Chris and pushed the officer's hand away. The officer stumbled back slightly, surprised by the force. Charlotte's stomach dropped as the situation went from tense to explosive in an instant. Officer Grant whirled around, his face flushed with anger. "You need to calm down," he snapped, his voice louder now. "You can't touch an officer." But Nathaniel was undeterred. His eyes were blazing with fury. "You've had no right to treat any of us like this. You've been harassing our guests all day. I'm done with it." The air felt charged, as if everyone present could sense the breaking point fast approaching. The Johnsons' home, once filled with light and laughter, had become the stage for a confrontation that no one had expected, a situation that threatened to spiral out of control. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "Enough!" she cried, her gaze flicking between the officers and her husband. "This is our home, and you are not going to ruin this day for us." But the tension was too thick. The officers were clearly not about to back down, and neither was Nathaniel. As the conflict continued to escalate, the world around them seemed to fall away. The backyard, the decorations, the balloons, all of it faded into the background as the only thing that mattered now was the struggle for control, the fight for dignity, and the desperate hope that somehow this moment wouldn't define them. Charlotte stood at the center, her mind racing for a way to de-escalate the situation, to protect her family, and to somehow salvage what was left of Ethan's birthday. But in that moment, it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. The scene in the Johnsons' backyard had descended into utter chaos. The laughter and joy that had filled the air just hours ago now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the harshness of fear and tension. The officer's presence had shifted from an inconvenience to an outright confrontation, with every movement feeling like it could ignite something even more dangerous. The moment it happened, everything seemed to slow down. Officer Grant, his anger growing, had zeroed in on one of the teenagers near the bouncy castle, a young boy who was barely 16. The teenager, his eyes wide with confusion and fear, had backed away instinctively as the officer moved toward him. His body language screamed nervousness, but it was too late. Officer Grant's hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him roughly towards him. The boy cried out, trying to shake free. "I didn't do anything. Let me go," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. But Officer Grant's grip was unyielding, and he began patting the teenager down with excessive force, checking his pockets as though he were dealing with a hardened criminal. The teenager winced under the officer's hands, trying to twist away, but it was like fighting a vice. In that instant, the scene became a powder keg, ready to explode. The other guests watched in stunned silence, some stepping forward as if to intervene, others hesitating, unsure of how to handle the overwhelming situation. And then, in the midst of it all, Charlotte's father, Mr. Wilson, who had been quietly standing to the side, observing the growing tension, could take no more. A towering figure in his 60s, with a stern but loving presence, he had always been the rock of the family. But seeing the officer's brutality, seeing the fear in the eyes of his granddaughter, and the helplessness in his son-in-law's posture, something snapped inside him. With a swift movement, he stepped forward, his voice rising above the noise. "Stop! Enough," he demanded, his tone fierce and commanding, full of the authority that years of wisdom and experience had given him. He wasn't asking, he was telling. He moved toward Officer Grant, his expression one of utter determination, ready to put an end to the injustice unfolding before him. But it happened too quickly, and in the heat of the moment, Mr. Wilson misstepped. His feet tangled as he moved forward, his balance lost in the frenzy of the moment. He staggered, his hands reaching out instinctively to steady himself, but it was too late. His left foot caught the edge of the concrete planter that bordered the garden. The sickening sound of his head striking the sharp edge of the stone echoed through the yard. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. For a moment, everything froze. Mr. Wilson's body crumpled to the ground with a heavy thud, and his head hit the concrete with a force that sent a spasm of horror through everyone who saw it. Time seemed to stretch out, the image of him lying there motionless, his body unnaturally still, engraving itself into the memory of every single person present. Charlotte's heart stopped. It was as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She stood frozen for a split second, unable to process what had just happened. The moment her father's body hit the ground, reality crashed down on her like a wave. She let out a sharp, agonizing scream, a sound that tore through the already tense atmosphere, and rushed toward her father. "Mom! Grandpa!" Ethan's terrified voice broke through the chaos as he tried to reach her, his tiny hands clutching at her skirt. Charlotte barely noticed as she fell to her knees beside her father, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his neck, desperately searching for a pulse. Her heart raced as she tried to stay calm, but the warmth that should have been there was gone. He was cold, and the blood beginning to pool around his head sent a flood of panic through her. "Somebody help!" she screamed, her voice cracking, but no one moved. The officers had stopped what they were doing, their attention momentarily diverted to the sudden tragedy that had unfolded. Officer Grant stood still for a moment, looking down at the scene, his face a mask of disbelief. The other guests, family and friends, had gathered in a tight circle around them, faces pale and filled with shock. No one knew what to do, how to react. The noise of the party had gone silent, replaced by the weight of a horrible reality. Charlotte cradled her father's head in her lap, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Daddy, please stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed her cheek to his. Her hands were covered in his blood now, but she didn't care. All she could do was hold him and pray that somehow, by some miracle, he would wake up. The officer nearest her, a younger man who had been silently watching, took a tentative step forward. "Ma'am, I didn't mean for this to happen." His voice was shaky, as if he were struggling to find the words to make sense of the chaos he'd contributed to. Charlotte glared at him, her chest tight with rage. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" she repeated, her voice a low, seething whisper. "You've done more than enough already." A sharp cry broke through the air as someone else in the crowd pulled out their phone. "I'm calling an ambulance," a woman shouted, her voice trembling. "We need an ambulance now." In the midst of the chaos, one of the officers finally seemed to grasp the gravity of what had just happened. His face, once cold and detached, now showed the beginnings of remorse. Or was it guilt? He reached for his radio, but the damage had already been done. It didn't matter how quickly they called for help now. Mr. Wilson, a man who had always been the heart of the family, was lying there, unconscious and bleeding. And no amount of apologies or regrets could undo what had just transpired. Charlotte's mind raced with a fury that consumed her. How had it come to this? How had a simple birthday celebration, one meant for joy, for laughter, turned into something so violent, so senseless? But as she looked down at her father, the world around her seeming to spin faster and faster, there was only one thought that burned in her mind. She would make sure this would never be forgotten. The pain of this moment, the injustice they had faced, would not be brushed aside. It was no longer just about the party. It was about something far greater. It was about standing up, even when it seemed impossible, to the violence that had been thrust upon her family on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The world around Charlotte seemed to fade into a blur as she knelt beside her father. The sight of him, lying motionless on the cold, unforgiving concrete, was something she couldn't fully comprehend. His blood pooled beneath him, stark against the white of his shirt, and his once strong frame now appeared fragile and broken. The faint rise and fall of his chest was the only sign that he was still alive, but the reality of the situation settled over her like a thick, suffocating fog. She couldn't understand how things had spiraled so quickly, from a simple birthday party to this nightmare. The officers who had once been so confrontational were now stepping back, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. They exchanged nervous glances, their earlier certainty replaced with doubt and uncertainty. Officer Grant, however, stood his ground. His posture was rigid, his face still locked in a defensive expression, as if he were bracing for the fallout. "It's not what it looks like," he muttered under his breath, though no one was really listening. His voice was almost drowned out by the frantic activity around him. Charlotte's fury flared at the sound of his voice. How dare he? How dare he make excuses when it was his actions, his escalation, that had brought them to this point? With every ounce of anger she had, Charlotte turned on him, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "Your actions have left my father lying here, unconscious and bleeding," she shouted, her words trembling with emotion. "What part of this do you think was justified, Officer Grant? What part of this investigation required you to treat us like criminals, like we were less than human?" She could barely contain the seething rage that bubbled up from deep inside her. This wasn't just about her father. It wasn't just about the family celebration turned tragedy. This was about a pattern of injustice that had played out time and time again, not just here, but in communities across the country. Charlotte had known it. She had seen it in the way people were treated, in the way her own family was often judged simply because of the color of their skin. The officer's expression faltered for a moment. He opened his mouth, perhaps to say something, but no words came out. The weight of Charlotte's accusation hung in the air between them like a suffocating cloud. Just give us a moment," he muttered, looking away as he began to step back from the scene. His words were hollow, his attempt at justification failing in the face of what had just occurred. But Charlotte could not focus on him now. Her eyes remained locked on her father. She squeezed his hand, which was now cold and clammy, and whispered frantically, "Please, Daddy, please don't leave us. Stay with me. Please stay with us." The paramedics had arrived in a flurry of motion, their voices cutting through the tension, their hands working swiftly and with practiced efficiency as they assessed Mr. Wilson's condition. Charlotte's throat tightened, and she felt the bitter sting of helplessness wash over her. She was a mother, a wife, a daughter, yet at that moment, she was powerless. She couldn't do anything to stop the pain, to stop the damage that had been done to her father and her family. One of the paramedics knelt beside her, gently urging her to step aside so they could work. "Ma'am, we need to stabilize him. Please, step back," he said kindly but firmly. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable urgency behind it. Charlotte felt her legs give way beneath her, the full weight of the situation crashing down on her. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only watch as the paramedics worked to keep her father alive. Every moment stretched on painfully, each second filled with the desperate hope that he would open his eyes and tell her that everything was going to be okay. But those eyes remained closed, and the silence that filled the air was deafening. Around her, the guests had fallen into a hushed stupor, many of them frozen in place, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and horror. Some were still holding their phones, recording the events. Others stood in small, whispering groups, trying to make sense of what had happened. But Charlotte felt as if she were in a bubble, a world entirely separate from the one around her. Her thoughts spun wildly, her heart racing as she watched the paramedics work on her father. The anger that had once been so fierce now seemed to smolder within her, a slow burn that would not be extinguished until the truth came out. She would make sure of that. No one would be allowed to sweep this under the rug. As the paramedics continued their efforts, the rest of the family began to stir, moving toward Charlotte with uncertain steps, their faces etched with concern. Her mother, Maria, was the first to reach her, wrapping her arms around Charlotte in a tight, comforting embrace. "We're going to get through this," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We will. I'm here. We're all here." Charlotte nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. It was hard to focus on anything other than the image of her father, lying there so still, so vulnerable. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had just been celebrating, just laughing and enjoying each other's company. Now, everything had changed. The sirens from the ambulance grew louder as it pulled into the driveway, and the paramedics began to load Mr. Wilson onto a stretcher. Charlotte watched them carefully, her heart in her throat. She stood to her feet, her legs unsteady, but she wasn't going to let him go. Not without a fight. Not without answers. As they loaded her father into the ambulance, Charlotte's gaze flickered over the officers, over Officer Grant, standing off to the side, his face as unreadable as ever. He hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged the gravity of his actions. And Charlotte knew, deep down, that she could never forget what had happened today. This wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about the way her family had been treated, the way her community had been treated, for far too long. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off, Charlotte stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her grief settle deep into her bones. Her father was not yet out of danger, and she would not rest until justice was served. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that she couldn't face it alone. With her family at her side, she would find the strength to fight for what was right. The pain was unbearable, but the truth, she was certain of it, would come to light. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the incident blurred together for Charlotte and Nathaniel. The sterile smell of the hospital, the incessant beeping of machines, and the cold, harsh fluorescent lights became their constant companions as they kept vigil at Mr. Wilson's side. His condition remained critical, and although the doctors were working tirelessly to stabilize him, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of helplessness. Every time she glanced at her father, lying unconscious with tubes and wires attached to him, the full weight of the violence he had suffered hit her all over again. The world outside the hospital room continued to spin, but inside, time felt as though it had come to a halt. The birthday party that had once been a symbol of joy and celebration now seemed like a distant memory, swallowed by the tragic events that followed. Charlotte refused to leave his side, her thoughts consumed with both grief and a burning sense of injustice. She couldn't just sit there and wait for the world to move on. She couldn't forget what had happened. She couldn't forget the officers who had stormed her family's celebration, the brutality, the pain. She had to do something. Nathaniel, equally devastated, stayed close by, but his demeanor had shifted. He was no longer the calm, collected man who had been hosting their party with a smile on his face just days before. His hands were often clenched into fists, his eyes filled with frustration as he tried to make sense of it all. The incident had shaken him to his core, and though he remained strong for Charlotte, he too was grappling with the overwhelming emotions of the ordeal. But they weren't alone. The moment the video of Mr. Wilson's fall hit social media, it quickly went viral. The footage, showing the aggressive confrontation between the officers and the guests, including the horrifying moment Mr. Wilson was knocked unconscious, ignited a firestorm of outrage. News outlets picked up the story, and it wasn't long before the community, both local and beyond, began rallying around the Johnson family. Messages of support flooded their phones, texts, emails, phone calls, even letters from strangers who had seen the videos and wanted to offer their help. Neighbors, friends, and even people who had never met Charlotte and Nathaniel before came to the hospital, bringing food, flowers, and words of encouragement. People marched in the streets, demanding justice, holding signs with phrases like, "Justice for Mr. Wilson," and "End police brutality." The movement gained momentum quickly, and what had started as a personal tragedy for the Johnsons became a rallying cry for so many others who had experienced similar injustices. Despite the overwhelming support, the weight of it all was suffocating. Charlotte felt as though the whole world was watching them, waiting for action, for something to change. She was grateful for the solidarity, but she also knew that the true battle was only just beginning. This wasn't just about public outrage. It was about making sure that justice was served, that her father's suffering was not in vain. Charlotte wasted no time. The very next day, she called a meeting with a group of legal experts, knowing that she needed to understand what steps to take next. She needed to be prepared to fight for her father, to ensure that the officers who had treated her family with such cruelty would be held accountable. As she sat in the conference room, the weight of the decisions ahead pressing down on her, Charlotte spoke with a clear and unwavering voice. "We can't let this go," she told the lawyer who had agreed to represent them. "This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that continues to treat people like my family as less than human. We need to make sure that this never happens again." The lawyer nodded, his face grim. "We'll take this as far as we need to. You're not alone in this. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Despite the assurances, Charlotte knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The legal system was a maze of obstacles, and the officers involved in the incident would likely have powerful allies. But she couldn't let fear stop her. For the sake of her father, for her community, and for all those who had been hurt by the same injustices, she had to stand firm. Meanwhile, Nathaniel took a different approach. He began speaking with community leaders and activists, strategizing ways to bring more attention to the case. His calm demeanor and deep sense of justice made him a natural leader, and soon he was helping to organize protests, vigils, and rallies. The goal was clear, not just to demand justice for Mr. Wilson, but to bring long overdue reform to the police department and beyond. The protests, while peaceful, were powerful. Hundreds of people gathered outside the police precinct, chanting for justice, holding signs that demanded accountability. News stations covered the events, the sound bites from Charlotte and Nathaniel echoing in living rooms across the country. It was no longer just about one family's pain. It was about the collective pain of communities that had been suffering under the same system of oppression for far too long. But in the midst of all this, Charlotte found herself torn between the need to keep fighting and the overwhelming weight of grief. There were moments when she would close her eyes and remember the sound of Ethan's laughter at his birthday party or the warmth of her father's embrace. In those moments, she felt a flicker of the life she wanted to return to. The life before all of this, before the police, before the violence. As she sat in the hospital room, watching over her father, she knew that this fight was hers to lead. The anger she had once felt now morphed into something far more powerful, a deep, unrelenting determination to right the wrongs that had been done to her family and her community. She would not let the truth be buried. She would not let her father's suffering be forgotten. And so, with the support of her family, her community, and countless others who had been moved by the injustice, Charlotte pushed forward. The battle for justice was far from over, but she could feel the first stirring of hope in her heart. The world was beginning to pay attention. The world was starting to listen, and the Johnson family would never back down. The weeks that followed were grueling. Charlotte and Nathaniel hardly left the hospital, but they found the strength to continue with their mission. Mr. Wilson's condition remained touch and go, but there was a spark of hope when he finally regained consciousness. It wasn't just his physical health that had suffered. The emotional scars were deep, and the constant pain and frustration weighed on everyone, especially Charlotte. Still, her resolve to seek justice never wavered. She knew her father's recovery would be a long road, but she also knew that the fight for accountability had only just begun. By now, the case had gained national attention. The video of Mr. Wilson's fall had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms, news outlets, and even reaching some powerful influencers. The cries for justice were deafening, and the pressure on the local authorities to act was immense. Charlotte was overwhelmed at times by the outpouring of support, but she also found strength in the collective voice that had joined their fight. The videos, the protests, the solidarity. It was all a reminder that they weren't fighting alone. Still, the legal battle was a constant uphill climb. The officers involved, led by Officer Grant and the department as a whole, fought fiercely to protect their reputation. They hired high-powered attorneys, and their defense was as aggressive as it was relentless. They claimed that the officers had acted within the scope of their duties, that Mr. Wilson had been the aggressor, and that the situation had spiraled out of control due to the hostile nature of the crowd. For Charlotte, it was a gut-wrenching process to hear these defenses, lies, in her mind, unfold in court. But the evidence was undeniable. The footage, captured on several phones, was irrefutable. It showed a peaceful family gathering turned into chaos by the officers' unnecessary and brutal response. The images of Mr. Wilson's violent fall haunted everyone who saw them, and in the courtroom, they became the focal point of the trial. Charlotte didn't back down. She took the stand, her voice unwavering as she described the pain of that day, the joy of the birthday party that had been shattered, the fear that had gripped her father's body as he lay on the ground, and the shock that still lingered in her bones. As the trial went on, more and more voices joined the Johnsons' cause. Community members who had witnessed the events came forward, recounting their stories. The weight of the case grew heavier, but so did the support for Charlotte and her family. The voices of the oppressed and marginalized were louder than ever, and they demanded justice. Then came the ruling. The court found the officers guilty of unlawful conduct and excessive use of force. Officer Grant, in particular, was suspended, and the other officers involved were disciplined in varying degrees. It was a victory, but it felt hollow in the wake of the violence they had endured. Charlotte felt a strange mix of relief and bitterness as the verdict was read aloud. While she was grateful for the justice they had secured, she knew that no verdict could erase the scars left by that day. No ruling could bring her father's health back to where it once had been. The case against Mrs. Carter also saw a resolution. It was determined that her false report had been a key factor in escalating the situation unnecessarily. Her claims of a disturbance based on racial prejudices and unwarranted suspicions had set the officers on the path to violence. The court ordered her to pay damages to the Johnson family, as well as attend sensitivity training. For Charlotte, the ruling felt like a small victory, one that wasn't about revenge, but about holding those who perpetuate harm accountable. Mrs. Carter's actions had been a catalyst for the tragedy, and seeing her face the consequences was a small piece of justice for everything her family had endured. As Charlotte walked out of the courthouse with her family by her side, she felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion wash over her. The emotional toll of the past few months had been immense. She thought of her father, still recovering in the hospital, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. There was no real winner in this situation. Not when lives had been shattered, when fear had been planted so deeply in her community. No legal ruling could bring back the moments lost or erase the pain. But there was something else. As she stood beside Nathaniel, their hands intertwined, and as the crowd of supporters gathered outside, holding signs, chanting for justice, Charlotte realized that this victory, though bittersweet, was not the end. It was a beginning. "We did it," Nathaniel said softly, his voice barely audible in the roar of the crowd. But Charlotte could hear the weight of his words. He was right. They had done it. They had faced the system that had tried to silence them, and they had brought about a change, however small. But Charlotte knew it wasn't just about the win in the courtroom. It was about the ripple effect it would have. This was bigger than her father, bigger than their family. It was a message, a reminder that the power of a community, united in the pursuit of justice, could move mountains. It was a victory for all those who had suffered under the weight of systemic injustice. It was a victory for the countless voices who had been ignored, silenced, or dismissed. Charlotte turned to face the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't need to say anything. The energy of the moment spoke for her. She was determined to keep fighting, not just for her family, but for every person who deserved to feel safe, respected, and seen in their community. "We'll keep fighting," she whispered to Nathaniel, a quiet promise in the midst of the cheers around them. And as she looked out at the sea of supporters, her resolve was stronger than ever. The road ahead was long, and there would be more battles to face. But this victory, this moment of justice, was a testament to the strength of their family and the power of their community. Charlotte had made a promise to her father, to her family, and to the countless others who had stood with them. She would never back down. Justice and accountability had prevailed today, but the fight for true change was far from over. As Charlotte stood at the front of the courthouse, surrounded by family, friends, and supporters, a profound sense of hope washed over her. The fight had been long, and the cost had been great. Her father, though physically recovering, would never be the same. The trauma, the fear, the uncertainty, those scars ran deep. Yet, as she looked out at the faces of the people who had stood with them, the voices raised in unison for justice, Charlotte knew this victory wasn't just for them. It was for everyone who had ever felt the weight of injustice, who had ever been silenced or dismissed simply because of who they were. The victory in court was not the end of their journey. It was the beginning of something far larger than herself. It was a spark, one that would ignite further conversations, actions, and, most importantly, change. The path to true equality and justice would take more than a courtroom verdict. It would require continued advocacy, the dismantling of deep-seated prejudices, and the courage to speak out when wrongs were done. But in that moment, surrounded by the voices of their community, Charlotte felt the first taste of what was possible when people refused to accept the status quo. As she walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand with Nathaniel and the rest of her family, Charlotte made a silent vow. She would honor her father's strength by continuing to fight, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered in silence for far too long. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but Charlotte knew that as long as they had each other, as long as the community stood united, no injustice would go unnoticed. The fight for equality and respect had just begun, and Charlotte was ready to lead it, with unwavering determination and an unshakable belief that, together, they could change the world. And though the road would be long and uncertain, she no longer feared what lay ahead. She knew now that justice, though hard-earned, was worth every battle, for they had proven, once and for all, that the power of truth, love, and solidarity could never be defeated. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your support means the world to us, and we're so grateful you took the time to be here. If you found this story meaningful or impactful, please don't forget to give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update from us. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us continue to create powerful content and share important stories like this one. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what resonated with you. Your voice matters, and we value your feedback. Thank you again for being part of this journey. Together, we can amplify these messages and create a more informed, compassionate world. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next video.